as you drive through each small town is that somewhere in the region a physician lives and practices, supporting the health and well-being of that community, and whom in many ways supports the continued existence of that small town. Settled in these picturesque communities, it's easy to romanticize about the peaceful, quiet life of a rural doctor. So much so that the cliché has been represented in Hollywood films on more than one occasion. Yet behind clinic doors, a different reality exists. A reality that is burdened by many of the same attractions of rural life. Peace and quiet also mean isolation. Uninterrupted landscapes also mean a lack of facilities. And autonomy of work means being solely responsible for your patient's well-being. My name is Lindsay Webster. My colleague Daniel Rees and I are both medical students and filmmakers. In 2019, we combined our passion for filmmaking and our experiences in medicine to dissect the realities of our province's rural healthcare system. We rented a van, packed it full of camera gear, and departed on a 2-week mission to speak with rural doctors across Newfoundland and Labrador. From east to west, up the Great Northern Peninsula to St. Anthony, and as far north as Happy Valley Goose Bay, conducting in-person, on-camera interviews with physicians from numerous different specialties. We wanted to hear what they had to say about finding balance on the distant edges of Canada's remote East Coast. Our goal was simple: to assess the state of physician well-being and professional support in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. We asked the tough questions, and what better way to get the answers than directly from the source? The struggles these doctors face are a reality that compromises the viability and ultimately the sustainability of these communities and the locals who live there. So what challenges are our rural doctors currently facing? In an unbalanced healthcare system, how do these providers maintain their own sense of balance? What can we do to support the doctors who do so much for their rural communities? Ultimately, what is the future of healthcare in rural Newfoundland and Labrador?
"40 years ago, as a young surgeon, I sailed across the western Atlantic to the coast of Labrador in the hope that I might be of some service to the seamen who ply their calling in those dangerous waters. With the aid of helpful people throughout the civilized world, we've managed to keep the work going ever since."
This interview with Sir Wilfrid Grenfell from 1931 sees him in his last decade of life. Here, he describes his early work as a physician in rural, remote Newfoundland and Labrador and the extensive support that was required to sustain these medical services for these remote coastal communities. Flash forward to the new millennium when the Canadian Medical Association stated that the healthcare infrastructure and level of professional support in rural and remote areas are insufficient to provide quality care and retain and recruit physicians. Flash forward another 20 years to the present, and physicians, certainly the ones we sat down with, are still concerned about these same inequities. How is it that 100 years later, from the Grenfell years to the cottage hospitals to our healthcare system today, physicians are still stressing the same issues? Has anything actually changed? What can we do to make lasting change? It's time to find out. Our journey began with a 1,600-kilometer drive from St. John's to Goose Bay, Labrador. This leg of our trip underscored the challenging geography of our province from the start. Long stretches of roadway without cell phone service, a 2-hour ferry ride to Labrador's southern coast, and 500 kilometers of gravel roadway cutting through Labrador's interior. This long drive gave us time to contemplate Newfoundland and Labrador's complex geography. Newfoundland and Labrador as a whole is quite remote and underpopulated. In fact, only 1.5% of Canada's population lives here. And with 371,000 square kilometers of land stretching from the Avalon Peninsula all the way up to the northernmost tip of Labrador, it provides people the space to stretch out. Close to 41% of its 500,000 inhabitants live in rural communities. This also means that Newfoundland and Labrador has the lowest population density of any Canadian province. Here, only 1.4 people live per square kilometer, which is considerably less than somewhere like Toronto, which has a density of almost 1,000 times that. In fact, in some regions, moose outnumber people 4 to 1. Far removed from any urban center, the rural lifestyle has a lure. Inhabitants of these remote communities wake up to the sound of crashing waves, not traffic. Work? A 10-minute walk, not an hour commute. Friends, colleagues, teachers, often one and the same. There may be a grocery store, a post office, a church. But what the community might lack in amenities is easily made up in the sense of togetherness that bonds its people. But with this isolation comes a staggering number of challenges. Higher transportation costs means food is considerably more expensive and rarely fresh. Ferries service shrinking communities that dot the coastlines. Travel to a city center, whether it be for healthcare or recreation, is time-consuming, costly, and sometimes dangerous on poorly maintained roads. Providing electricity to these isolated communities comes at a huge expense, encouraging people to heat their homes with wood stoves. Even internet access, a human right in the eyes of the United Nations, is no guarantee in some of these communities. Two full days of driving later, and we were nearly at the end of our journey's first leg. As we coasted into the town of Happy Valley Goose Bay, we were lucky to make it without running out of gas. However, as we began exploring the community, we knew our endeavor was well worth the effort. At the Labrador Health Center in Happy Valley Goose Bay, we were met by Dr. Samantha Harper, a rural generalist originally from Ottawa, Ontario.
My name is Samantha Harper, and I'm a graduate of family medicine residency training through Memorial University. And part of that training involved coming up here to Labrador as a resident. And I liked the practice so much and the work that was done up here that I stayed on afterwards. I'm from Ontario originally, but rural family medicine really appealed to me. Again, I liked the opportunity to do many different things. It's really great up here. We get to do air ambulance work, labor and delivery, emergency room work, your typical family practice clinic work. And we also are able to go up to remote Indigenous communities and provide care in nursing stations up there. So it's a really great opportunity to, again, have that full scope of family medicine that you just don't get in urban environments. And I like the outdoors. Again, I grew up in the city, but I like being in the wilderness. And there's just so much of that up here in Labrador. It is the big land, they call it.
Harper's love for the outdoors and wide open spaces has made her life in Happy Valley Goose Bay satisfying. But she also takes her adventures outside the province, and she says working in rural Labrador is what makes that possible.
So I've done the Marathon des Sables, which is an ultra marathon in Morocco. It's 250 kilometers. It's split over roughly a week in varying degrees of length and difficulty. And I've done that 5 times. I did it once. People encouraged me to come back and do it again. I did it 5 times. So it was a fun challenge. It's hard, but that was something that I thought was really cool. And then I've also sailed around the world as part of the Clipper Around the World yacht race. You know, we work hard here, why not play hard? I have my health. You know, that's a gift. Not everybody is in a situation financially or physically where they can take on these kinds of challenges. I've got a supportive employer who allows me enough time off to do these things. The ocean racing is pretty grueling. It is relentless. It's 24 hours a day. So we left England, sailed around the whole world, and came back to England. And you only live once. I think in medicine, we see a lot of bad things happen to good people. And I think taking your health for granted is, I think it's all too common. So I like to think that, if I were to die tomorrow, I could look back and say, wow, I've done some pretty awesome stuff.
Harper's enthusiasm for her rural life was contagious, and although she acknowledged some of the challenges of her rural practice, she seemed to carry these in stride. In search of more perspectives, we packed up our van and headed south. Back over the Labrador Highway, across the ferry, and landing in St. Anthony. On the remote tip of Newfoundland's northern peninsula, we sat down with veteran pathologist Dr. Kwaku Dankwa.
My full name is actually Isando Kwaku Dankwa. I originally come from Ghana, and in Ghana, the name Kwaku is given to a boy who was born on Wednesday. And then Isando is the ancestral name for somebody who had done probably good deeds in the past and wants to be remembered. So my medical school was in a town called Accra, Ghana, and my pathology training started off from there. Following that, I moved on to the UK at the University of Bristol. And following that, I worked in a place called the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C.
Dankwa's position as chief pathologist for the entire Labrador-Grenfell region means his workload is never ending. We asked him how he is able to maintain his own well-being under this constant demand.
What I'm going to say next may annoy a lot of people, but I'll go ahead anyway. I work every day. When I say every day, I mean Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I work every day. And I work on public holidays. The only time I don't work is when I'm away on holiday and I'm out of town. And I always say another way I give myself some to recover is usually around lunch break. I walk home. I find a way of walking back home, walking back in, rain or shine. And I think that also takes you off work. I mean, you can go to the canteen and have a meal or whatever, but then you are still in that environment. Get out of it. My walk route normally will take me all the way around down here, go around town, right to the other area there. And then when I feel that things are getting overwhelming and I'm just being distracted, I take a bit of a break, and I have a couple of these with me, and I struggle with it for a while, and then by the time I finish, I feel relieved to take on the day's work again.
Dankwa offered valuable insights into his life in St. Anthony. Keen to hear more perspectives, we packed up our van and headed down the Northern Peninsula. We next met with Dr. Susan Russell, a community-based pediatrician in Deer Lake.
So I'm Susan Russell. I'm a pediatrician. I practice here in Deer Lake. I'm from St. John's originally. Grew up in St. John's, did university in Ontario, came back to St. John's for medical school, did residency in Memorial, but went to Halifax to do a fellowship in neonatology. My husband is from Deer Lake, so that's how we ended up back in Deer Lake. He wanted to come back here to practice.
Pediatricians typically work in city centers, are based in hospitals, and salaried by their healthcare authority. So when Dr. Russell wanted to open up her own rural, community-based fee-for-service practice, she was doing something pretty unique.
I applied to Western Memorial Hospital, and they said they didn't need a pediatrician. I had just had a baby, so I decided, well, I mean, I could sit home and just raise kids, but I did all this medical school training, so I still want to practice. So I thought, well, can I be, like, in Ontario, you can be a primary care pediatrician. Could I make that work in Newfoundland? So I applied to the Newfoundland Medical Board and checked with MCP, and everybody kind of said, I suppose, give it a try kind of thing. So I didn't know what to expect. But I think that's been a positive in a lot of ways because I created the practice that worked for me, and I can continue to change what works for me.
Despite the area's aging population, Dr. Russell's vision allowed her rural pediatric practice to flourish.
A large percentage of our population, which is I don't think uncommon in Newfoundland, is 49 or older. I think currently there's 5,000 to 6,000 people in Deer Lake and surrounding area. Less than 1,000 of them are kids, so it's a small percentage of the population. But I see kids from as far as St. Anthony, all the way down to Francois. I have kids that come in from Botwood to see me, so I see them from all over.
For Dr. Russell, running a successful pediatric practice amongst an aging population can often be as difficult as navigating her roles as a friend and a physician in this small town.
You're the physician, so it's difficult to establish a social group because that person was just in your office today crying about their divorce. And now you've got to go to the hockey rink and pretend you never heard it and chat over French fries about the novice hockey team. That's challenging. It's difficult. It's difficult for them. And as much as we're trained not to let it be difficult, it's still difficult for us, you know? So sometimes you are seen as somebody, as the holder of their secrets, and so that can be difficult. In addition, what has really changed since I first moved here is in the last 10 years, I think internationally, we've seen an explosion of social media. We are so accessible 24 hours a day because of social media and social media accounts that it becomes challenging to practice medicine when the person you're going to sit next to tomorrow morning at hockey practice Facebook message you at 11:30 at night to tell you that they think their kid has an ear infection. And I don't practice medicine over Facebook, and I don't practice medicine via the internet, and I actually don't open those messages. I don't open them to read them because I know that I'm going to feel pressured into practicing medicine through 11:30 at night via Facebook. So the benefits of being here and that it's a small town and everybody knows you, and I have a 4-minute commute to work and a half a kilometer commute to my kids' elementary school, and there's safety and no time lost in commuting, and the fact that I can close my practice at any time that I want to because my kid's got a hockey tournament in Gander and I'm just not going to work next Friday. It also makes it challenging because people feel that they own you and that you are going to do your job any time of the night or day, whether you're paid or not. That may have been the way of life 40 or 50 years ago for physicians, but I think we have evolved and changed medicine so that that isn't it, or it shouldn't be the way physicians are practicing medicine. And I think part of the burnout for rural physicians is that you feel that you're practicing every minute of every day because everybody knows you're the doctor.
Despite the fact that she leaves her stethoscope in the office at the end of each day, Dr. Russell's identity as the town's pediatrician means that normal encounters with friends and family can turn into a clinic visit at any time. Even in her own home, the existence of social media means that the virtual door is never closed. This level of demand can put a doctor's mental health at risk. Dr. Russell is passionate about reducing the stigma and improving access to mental health services for physicians.
It's no different than having pneumonia, right? It's just a medical problem, condition, we have to treat it. But there is a stigma around it, and a greater stigma if you're the doctor providing care to other people as well. Can you, as a physician, have depression, be treated, and treat your patients appropriately? Absolutely. But we don't feel that we can tell people. Yes, there's a number that you can call as a physician, and you can say that I'm feeling anxiety, stress, burnout, depression. I need somebody to talk to. And they say, okay, we'll call you back with an appointment. They call you back and they say, well, we've got an appointment for you to talk on the phone to a psychologist 2 Tuesdays from now. Well, 2 Tuesdays from now is a really long time. If you're feeling so much pressure, you made that phone call today. And that talk with that psychologist may only happen once a month. That's not great. So then you think, well, where can I go? Geez, the next closest person I could go to who might not know me might be a 3-hour drive away. Well, that's not going to work with my practice and 2 kids. So I think we just go without treatment because of all those barriers. I think if you're in a larger center, it's easier. You're in downtown Toronto, there's probably a counseling group who's never heard of you before. You can go and get help.
In contrast to Dr. Russell, Dr. Samantha Harper back in Goose Bay feels her small town and close-knit workplace is the ultimate form of support. Dr. Harper feels that her connection with her community helps her better manage her mental and physical well-being.
Here you're less anonymous, and I think if you were seen to be struggling, it would be harder to hide because, I mean, you guys have seen our office space. We're on a little horseshoe right here. You can't come to work and not say hi to somebody. You know, you can't come to work and not be seen. Everybody knows everybody else here, and I think people are fairly in tune if somebody is struggling. Or if someone's had a really terrible week and every emerge shift they've been on, there's been a horrible MVA. That's not a secret. Being more visible here and having more collegiality definitely makes those instances where you feel like you're just getting burnt out more bearable because you've got other people to lean on.
Heading east for the first time since we left St. John's, we arrived in Grand Falls, Windsor. Grand Falls, Windsor is a community of 14,000 people and nestled against the banks of the Exploits River, the largest and longest river on the island. Originally from Grand Falls, Dr. Jared Butler is a family doctor who returned to his community after residency to set up practice.
I'm back in my hometown working, which is a very unique and different thing to do. Like I said, I was born and raised here. I live here with my wife and my 3 dogs, and I have a blossoming sports medicine practice, which is going crazy at the moment, and a very large family medicine practice as well.
For Dr. Butler, returning to Grand Falls, Windsor was always a given, though he admits that practicing in his hometown comes with its own set of challenges.
I was always coming back to Grand Falls, Windsor. That was always my plan. When I went to medical school in Ireland, unfortunately my father passed away, leaving my mom here by herself. So I said, well, I'll definitely move home now and set up a practice. So I came home for personal reasons and also for family reasons. So these are my veg trucks, and these hold my Mexican tomatillas. And these are basically like a green tomato, but it's actually in the ground cherry family. Being born and raised here has positives and negatives. Both my parents, who've since passed on, were teachers here. You know, people realize, you know, my mom taught one half of this town, my dad taught the other half of this town, and I can't get away from that. I grow these every year because I love Mexican food. These are Hungarian wax chili in here, and believe it or not, this is actually part of my wellness as well. I often get asked in the produce oil what the test result was. My wife will tell you, I don't go to Walmart. I cannot walk through Walmart. The blessing, though, is you know the people. And when you do have issues or challenges, even on, say, a personal front, well, you know who to go to in this town, you know who to talk to. And the people themselves, when they have problems or concerns, they know, well, these are my patients, they come talk to me, and they know they're going to be helped out because, again, it's a family. I've used this line many times, that, you know, the old adage of it takes a village to raise a child is very true here. I feel very strongly about that for me. You know, this community helped raise me, and I feel a real strong sense of duty to get back to them and to be available for them, for their needs and their care.
Like Dr. Russell in Deer Lake, Dr. Butler struggles with the lack of anonymity in his community. However, this isn't a standalone issue.
Unfortunately, in central Newfoundland, our population is one of the biggest challenges that we face when it comes to healthcare. By 2030, it's estimated that over 40% of our population will be over the age of 65, which is going to be huge for us when it comes to chronic disease and preventative medicine in that older demographic. And even further down the road, it'll be a challenge for long-term care and care of the older adult. So we have a very unique challenge when it comes to an aging population with very few young people in the region. You mix that with the fact that here in the Exploits Valley, we are the diabetic capital of Newfoundland and Labrador, which makes us the diabetic capital of Canada, which makes us technically the diabetic capital of the world.
Dr. Butler's concerns about health demographics in central Newfoundland aren't unwarranted, but they're also not limited to central Newfoundland. Communities across the province are facing similar concerns. Our province's average age is 44 years old, 5 years above Canada's national average, and as high as 65 in some rural regions. This makes long-term care facilities already operating at capacity juxtapose classes of 5 to 10 students in the same community's schools. The healthcare needs of an aging population also put strain on an already pressured healthcare system, requiring fewer doctors and nurses to attend to more patients with increasingly complex health needs. And these health needs are complex. Newfoundland and Labrador is leading the nation in rates of obesity and diabetes. 41.1% of the population is considered obese and 10.1% have diabetes, a chronic disease that costs Canada approximately $3 billion per year and represents a massive burden to healthcare. Alcohol abuse and smoking rates are well above the national average, and less than half of the population achieves enough weekly physical activity to meet the national average. Newfoundland and Labrador is also leading the province in new cancer diagnoses per 100,000 people, which includes the highest rates of colorectal cancer in the country. With 4 physician interviews behind us, we were now starting to form a picture of what the challenges of rural healthcare look like. Isolation, unsustainable workloads, lack of privacy, and providing healthcare to a medically complex and aging population. What other challenges were these physicians facing? We continued east, looking for more doctors, wanting to hear their stories, and needing their answers. In Port Blandford, Dr. Jackie Elliott arrives at her clinic for another day's work. There's no trouble getting parking, as she owns and runs this clinic by herself. In fact, she's the only doctor in the area.
My name is Jackie Elliott, and I currently work as a family doctor in Port Blandford, Newfoundland. I am a solo family physician. Started here in 2015. I had been previously working in St. John's.
Unlike Dr. Butler back in Grand Falls, Windsor, who works in a large group practice and relies on that team environment, Dr. Elliott is on her own.
Probably the biggest challenge I have is going from a group practice of 6 down to a solo practice. I think because I'd had the 10 years experience before coming out here, I was a little bit more comfortable in my medicine and how I practice it, but being on your own is difficult. It's nice sometimes to have that person that you can just knock on their door or go and sit down and say, okay, I've got this case and it's a bit challenging. What would you do in this situation? How would you handle it? Or if you have a patient that's challenging on a personality basis, you sometimes need to be able to debrief, I guess, if you had a particularly challenging encounter. So that can be hard.
Continuing medical education, or CME, is an important aspect of practicing medicine, but can be difficult to achieve for the rural physician.
It can be difficult, and a lot of people who work in rural Newfoundland have identified trying to keep up on the CME as being a problem. There's other opportunities for CME within the province, but not necessarily locally, so you have to travel. The College of Family Physicians in Newfoundland does an annual scientific assembly every year, so you have to go to where that is in order to take part in it.
Dr. Elliott makes an important point. Attending medical conferences often requires our rural physicians to travel nationally or even internationally just to pursue the same learning opportunities as their urban colleagues. For Dr. Dankwa in St. Anthony, this requires a 5-hour drive to his regional airport in Deer Lake and many additional connecting flights just to arrive somewhere so seemingly accessible like Toronto, Ontario.
These days, we don't have an airline that is flying between the two places. When I started off here, that was the case, but it's stopped now. Occasionally, they put it back on. Otherwise, you have to go by road, drive. And come winter, you are literally stuck.
Dr. Russell is a rural physician who benefits from having a regional airport in her community. However, easier access to these conferences doesn't necessarily mean that they're relevant to her learning needs.
The difficulty is when you go to a conference and you've got pediatricians from across the country and they're all sitting in a room, what happens is that the focus of the talk needs to be what's most relevant to the majority of the people in the room. And the majority of the people in the room will work in a large center with tertiary care hospitals and multiple referral services. I was recently at a developmental conference in Toronto and I said, well, what do you do with your autistic patients who also have obsessive compulsive disorder? The therapy doesn't work, right? You can't do cognitive behavioral therapy with a kid who has autism who isn't capable of understanding what cognitive behavioral therapy does. What do you do with, oh, that's no problem. You just refer them to this center in downtown Toronto. Well, that's not helpful for me. I need some practical, real life, day-to-day solutions for what you do for these kids. So although the conferences are great in terms of the basics of medicine, applying that to rural practice doesn't always work.
Heading into the last few days of our journey, we arrived in Clarenville, a blossoming town of 7,000 in eastern Newfoundland. Here, we met up with physician colleagues, husband and wife team Dr. Sarah Small and Gordon Stockwell.
Of her rehearsal schedules usually.
Right.
But
I'm Gordon Stockwell. I grew up in Cambridge, Ontario. Moved here in 2006, and that was to study music. That's where Sarah and I met in music school.
Who wants to go first?
I studied piano and Gordon was a violin major.
We did a lot of our training in Clarenville, decided we liked the area. We like the outdoor lifestyle, the variety of practice that you get in a rural area. We decided to move to Clarenville in 2016, I guess was when I finished my residency.
Clarenville, for both of us, seemed like the perfect fit because we could practice in a rural area at the full scope of family medicine, as well as having a really great outdoor lifestyle.
Their exposure to rural practice during their residencies allowed them to connect with the appeal of rural family medicine.
During our residency program, we had the unique opportunity to be able to travel and practice in all different communities across the province, and that really gave us a great perspective into the things that we were looking for in our own practice.
Exposing students to rural practice during medical school is a well-known strategy for recruiting physicians to these areas when they graduate. Small and Stockwell's exposures drew them to Clarenville, though when they settled in, it didn't feel like the rural sites they'd trained in.
We were the first 2 MUN grads to come and practice family medicine in Clarenville in probably 15 years. So there was a period in the early 2000s where the family doctors pulled out of the hospital in Clarenville, and there was a bit of a separation that happened. That seemed to be the way things had gone for the last decade or more. Clinic was separate from hospital, and family doctors didn't work in the hospital.
We found it really interesting how difficult it was for us to practice as rural family doctors in a rural area. And so when we first came here, we felt like we were just urban physicians doing what we would do if we were in St. John's. So it took a little bit of time to work to break down those barriers.
Small and Stockwell believe that a diverse practice is an essential aspect for the rural family doctor, and they're working hard to bring that back to Clarenville.
The concept of doing half-time emerge was something that took some breaking down barriers, doing the walk-in clinic and getting involved in that way. Eventually we hope to take over the hospitalist services if we get a large enough group of like-minded people to do the coverage, as it's been a turnstile of international doctors going through the hospital over the last decade or more, and nobody with any continuity staying there. So we've got a lot of short and long-term goals to try and build a stronger relationship with the community, and Eastern Health's been very supportive of that, as they should be in a rural hospital.
Change takes time, and so we're just taking it baby steps for now, but we do have sort of a 10-year vision, and with a full team in place, I think we can have something really special.
And on the one hand, that's a challenge, and people say, well, I don't want to go there because this needs to happen, these changes need to happen. But on the other hand, we say, well, we can shape this the way we want to shape it.
We're really young, we've got a lot to learn, but we're hoping that over time we'll be able to create that special little niche here as well.
Dr. Butler in Grand Falls, Windsor acknowledges that variety is an important part of practice, but says that this requires a higher level of coordination by healthcare administrators.
If you come out here and you say, I would like to do 1 week in the hospital every 6 or 8 weeks as a hospitalist. I'd also like to do some OB care, maybe pick up a shift or 2 in emerge, and then you know what, I'll probably do a clinic, 2 days a week this week and 1 day a week next week and then 3 days. It's fine. Everywhere you're working, you're meeting a demand on the system. That to me is what really matters. What has to happen though is somewhere somebody within the regional health authority or in the province has to truly develop a physician resource plan and make sure that the needs of that region are being met. Because you can't have 12 people doing that and have no one over here doing this kind of work. Someone has to pick work X and do a little bit of that.
Enjoying a wide scope of practice in a variety of settings is a major appeal of rural medicine. However, having to practice medicine outside of your comfort level due to your geography is also something that rural doctors can encounter.
Access to the people that I need for the patient. When the patient needs to see that person, that's the difficult thing. So what ends up happening is, for example, with psychiatry, we do a lot of psychiatry in pediatrics, and I will try everything I have in my bag of tricks before I'll call psychiatry or developmental peds. But the implication and the pressure, both from the healthcare system and from the parent of the child, is that I function as that specialist, even though I'm not. Sometimes they'll say, well, you need to start, say, Haldol on this kid. And I think, well, geez, like, I don't know how I think about Haldol in a kid. Like, I don't do this normally. And if you were a pediatrician in St. John's, that would never be a suggestion. And it's not that they're not trying to help. They are trying to help, but the geography, the population, and the wait list sometimes makes me have to practice medicine that I'm not comfortable practicing. And I've actually started pushing back. I think we need to put pressure on the healthcare system to identify that this is an area of need. If I keep mopping up the need, they're not going to recognize it's a need.
Leaving Clarenville, we continued east and then down the Burin Peninsula. The town of Buren was an important site for our project, not just because of its breathtaking scenery, but because there were a number of doctors in this town that we wanted to interview. First on the list, Dr. Lynn Power.
I'm Lynn Power. I'm a family doc here in Buren. As a family doctor, I'm fortunate I get to work emergency department. I do my own procedures. I do house calls. I take care of patients in personal care homes. Just this morning, I had to go to the hospital because one of my dialysis patients needed to be end of life. So the value of what service I provide here, I think we all feel as family docs.
As with Dr. Small and Stockwell, Power's early exposure to rural practice inevitably drew her to the region.
In residency, I was lucky I got to come to Buren for 4 months. And in addition to my 4 months in residency, I actually did one of the remote clinical experiences here as well. And that really kind of allowed me to see the community. The Buren Peninsula has lots to offer. It certainly has great activities like hiking and outdoors. It's a super engaged community. And the more time I spent at the hospital, I thought, wow, like these, everybody seems like a big family. They work together. It seemed very collaborative. From a family medicine point of view, I guess the biggest thing that drew me was the variety of what the family doctors here do.
Like the other doctors we've spoken with, Dr. Power enjoys her scope of practice as a rural generalist. However, she also holds some important leadership positions in education and healthcare that make her comments all the more salient.
I'm the undergrad director for family medicine for Memorial University, and in addition, in the past year, I've become the rural clinical chief for the entire Buren Peninsula. So I have the opportunity to meet with all the undergrad directors from all across Canada, and some of the schools are catching us, but we have been the leader as to rural exposures. Memorial has the highest rate of people matching to family medicine in the country. So from a medical school, I think we recognize and do a really good job of giving our students those opportunities. As a rural doc, I think, I have a big part to play in promoting rural and the importance of it, and having the opportunity to be the undergrad director certainly gives me a voice at the table.
It is evident that in these roles, Dr. Power is passionate about providing opportunities for medical education in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. While she regularly hosts student learners as a family doctor, she worries about what opportunities are available to medical students who want to explore career options as a rural surgeon, obstetrician, or internist.
If we can't expose medical students to rural specialties, then how do we recruit to that lifestyle? Our trouble lies in that, the medical school, you have to be fully licensed to be able to be a preceptor, and most of our sites in rural areas are staffed by IMGs. So what we've done here, our specialists all have academic appointments with the discipline of family medicine, and so when our learners come and you say, I'm interested in surgery, I'd like to see what it's all about rurally, we'll try to get you some time there. We have to figure out if we're going to fix that problem, which is a huge barrier. I think the only way we can do it is just like we've done in family medicine, expose students early, let them see that rural surgeons have a great lifestyle, rural internists, this is what they do.
Dr. Power believes that recruiting more specialists to rural areas will require the same approach as family medicine, early exposure. An inability to recruit specialists to these areas creates many issues. Patients must travel for appointments, and family doctors are left without any backup in critical cases.
So we have 2 surgeons, and we have 1 obstetrician where we would normally have 2, 1 pediatrician where we would normally have 2. We have 1 psychiatrist, and we have 1 anesthetist. So we're short, and that means we rely on locums, or we close services and divert. When you come into Emerge here, it's not unusual to look at the shift schedule, and there's 3 services that have gaps. And so when you are yes, I thrombolize, but then I have to take care of the arrhythmias, and then I have to arrange transport. And if it's a snowstorm, they don't go anywhere. And so that patient is mine as the ER doc. I don't make a diagnosis and start treatment and hand over. They're my patient. So I think drawing more and more people to rural Newfoundland is tough as we have more and more gaps in specialty services.
While Dr. Power's concerns are valid, Buren has managed to recruit and retain some excellent general and specialist physicians, one of whom lives just down the road from Dr. Power's clinic.
I'm Dr. Arjun Raipuri. After I finished my residency training in University of Florida, Jacksonville, I was about to start a job in Baltimore, but there was a little bit of a small time gap I had before my permanent residency came through in US. So during this time gap, I wanted to check out places outside of US where I could work. And when I was looking to work in Canada, I saw that there's an opportunity in this place, Buren. I never knew where Newfoundland was until then, but I had an interview over the phone and took the job, and I came here to be here for just 1 year, not even a single day more than a year, and then go back and start working in Baltimore and join the family, Shobha and Shakti there.
Raya Putty moved here on a short-term locum in 2008, but fell in love with the region. He would later ask his wife and child to move to Buren so they could settle down here.
The place and the people and the practice, it just grew on me, and then I came as a stranger, and now we had the community. There was a huge celebration, and the community was so mindful and so inclusive of us. They did a plant-based kitchen. So instead of kissing the cod, they put lips on the cabbage, and so we kissed that. And then instead of drinking this screech, they brought some spring water from Ida Burkitt's well. So we drank the water, and we said this Newfoundland sayings. We learned about the Newfoundland flag, and so we had a blast. And there was a potluck to follow that. There were over like 50 different plant-based foods there, Newfoundland foods that are plantified. So that was a beautiful gesture.
How a community welcomes a physician and their family can be a key determining factor for their willingness to stay. For Arjun and his family, there was no question if they were welcome.
For some reason, I always felt like this was like home. I think it's because of the people, how welcoming and warm they are. Even within the first few months I started working here, I would have strangers clear my driveway. I would come out and the driveway is cleared. I don't know who cleared it. People would just knock on the door and drop some homemade bread and freshly picked berries. So it never felt like, yes, I'm coming from a different culture. I felt like they have always included us as a part of them.
Dr. Dankwa in St. Anthony had similar thoughts on the community's responsibility to make a physician and their family feel welcome.
What I would say is also key in this is spousal satisfaction. If a spouse is not happy, if somebody is married and their spouse is not happy, they will drive you out. There's no doubt about it. So the spousal satisfaction is key. What I often say is that if the community can make an extra effort to really try and engage the spouse and address some of the spousal needs, you would resolve a significant portion of that. I often say that when I came here, if I had come alone, and therefore I was very mobile, I probably would have moved within 3 months.
While Arjun and his family were welcomed into their new community, they did face an unexpected challenge. Dr. Shobha Rayapudi couldn't find work as a physician in their town.
Stay, go.
Shobha completed her medical residency in the United States. Her specialty? Preventative medicine, an emerging field of medicine that is still finding its niche in Canada.
Basically, my specialization is identifying the risk factors for chronic diseases and how those risk factors can be modified and utilized to prevent and also treat and reverse chronic conditions like diabetes, arthritis, heart disease.
Given Newfoundland and Labrador's aging population and significant disease burden, it would seem her skill set is needed. Unfortunately for Shobha, her certifications and education, while acknowledged by the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Physicians and Surgeons, did not license her to practice that type of medicine in our province.
When I told them I'm a preventive medicine doctor, they said, okay, can you do family practice, or can you do some other specialization so that there might be greater chances of you being employed here. But I was more passionate about preventive medicine. It was also quite shocking to me because you go through medical school, you invest so much of your time, and then you come here to a place where none of that skills could be applied. So it was quite easy for me to say, okay, there is nothing here for me, so maybe I want to move to a place where I can apply my skills.
Despite this, Shobha stayed. She saw how fulfilled Arjun seemed in their new community and wanted to foster that. Shobha decided to take her energy and skill set to help make her community healthier, but not from the clinic, this time from the kitchen.
So hello everyone, welcome to the live show.
So I'm just going to show you one dish.
So the pasta is all cooked.
This is just grated cauliflower and it just looks like cheese. The one thing that I know best is how to prevent diseases and how to bring about that behavior change in a population level. And after completing that first workshop, I was surprised at the reaction that I got from people. They were so grateful that they were getting this education, and that gave me ideas. Okay, maybe this is what people need here. Even though I'm not able to work in the hospital system, maybe I can do something to empower people to stay healthy and be a healthier version of themselves.
This initiative would grow to become the community-based food project called The Gift of Health. Offering workshops, potlucks, and teaching sessions, they have been able to share with their community something special to them. While there is a success story here for Arjun and Shobha, they acknowledge that it wasn't easy, and that spousal support is a huge issue for retaining rural doctors. Back in Grand Falls, Windsor, Dr. Jared Butler sees spousal support as his first concern when it comes to recruitment of new doctors.
When you're bringing in a doctor, I got to be honest with you, the last thing I think about is what the doctor wants to do. They're going to work. That's what they're here to do. The first thing we think about is, do they have a spouse? Do they have kids? And how can we help them get integrated into the community? If you integrate the family and they're happy and content and you can take care of them, the doctor will be happy.
Dr. Harper in Happy Valley Goose Bay admits that a lack of opportunity for her spouse will ultimately be the reason that she leaves her rural practice.
I think what a lot of rural communities struggle with, and I think what could be a foreseeable problem with me, is having spousal employment. So if your other half can't get a job in your small town, then it can really limit your ability to stay there long term or make it work. So I'm struggling with that right now. My other half has a job overseas. But yeah, it is tricky, and so I think that's not an issue unique to Labrador, but it is an issue that I think a lot of rural communities struggle with, is retaining a physician, but also, in doing so, retaining their significant other.
Back across the province in Deer Lake, Dr. Russell and her family are facing a much different dilemma.
My 7-year-old had a complicated postnatal history for about a week. He's fine now. But when he was 2, he was certainly not where we would expect him to be. And we did have a lot of talks then, because we had only been here 2 years, we hadn't bought a house. If we buy a house and he needs special care or special education, he's not going to get that here, and that's this small community. So we might have to move somewhere where there's a school that would cater to him. Now, luckily, I guess he was just a slow starter, but we have considered that in the past. We may not be able to stay because of one of our kids. If they need something different than the mainstream, they're not going to get it here. It's not that people aren't willing to offer it, they just can't offer it because they don't have the manpower. So I think whether we're here in 10 years or for the rest of our career really would depend on what our kids need.
For others, the future of their rural family is just beginning. During the later stages of this documentary's production, Dr. Sarah Small and Dr. Gordon Stockwell welcomed into the world their new baby boy, Charlie. With our journey soon drawing to an end, we crossed the isthmus and we're back on the Avalon Peninsula. With only 2 interviews left and still many questions left unanswered, we met with Dr. Chris Patey.
My name is Christopher Patey. I'm a family doc emerge doc, and I live in St. John's, but I work in Carbonear, and I have worked out there now for the last 12 years, I guess.
After Dr. Patey and his wife finished their medical training, they knew they wanted to return to the province.
Our goal was always to come back to Newfoundland, so we moved to St. Anthony and worked for a year there. I worked as a family doc and absolutely loved my practice as a rural family doctor, hospitalist, inpatients, emergency medicine, house calls, home visits, and it was a beautiful setup. My wife, on the other hand, was a radiologist and the only radiologist in a small town. So when we moved to St. Anthony, it was a difficult year. She was on call pretty much 24/7, despite not really being on the call rota, because physicians would call and say, can you look at this CAT scan for me? Can you look at these things for me? So it is difficult, especially when you're looking at 2 physicians in a rural community. All of a sudden the call schedule is no longer 1 in 6. Someone's on call all the time.
Dr. Patey had always envisioned working as a rural family doctor, but the realities of that life and the pressures it put on his family would inevitably lead him back to St. John's.
I mean, I pictured myself in St. Anthony with my wharf and my boat and moose hunting out around the corner. But you kind of get pulled to larger centers because your family's here and it's much easier for us all to work here. Ideally, I would have liked to work in a small rural town and have my setup with that, but it's really hard to maintain that. When I worked in St. Anthony, I left after a year. There was a period of time that I felt that I had failed. I always said when I was going to medical school, I was going to go back and work in a rural community. And I failed St. Anthony by not going back and working there. And when I hear it again, I hear people say that as well, they feel bad that they left a rural town. I think the most important thing is that you've spent time there and you get perspective and you gain perspective of what a rural community is and how physicians work there. So when the next rural doc calls you, when you're a subspecialist sitting in a gastro lab with someone who has rectal bleeding in St. John's, you know what, just send them. I'd love to see the patient. And you're very supportive of those rural family doctors who are sitting in those spots without any really resources or that number of residents and staff sitting behind them to help them out. Because often it's just them.
Patey notes that for a long time he felt like he was just another physician in the rural revolving door. But during his time in St. Anthony, there were other physicians who came and went. This turnover made it difficult for Patey and his wife to develop friendships with physician colleagues, eventually encouraging them to follow suit.
The majority of family doctors, or when they come out, are maybe 30, 35 before they have their first child. If you're in a small community, sometimes they're 20, 25 when they're having children, when they're living in those areas. So the dynamics of in terms of other couples and matching kids and play dates, those sort of things. So it is a little bit tricky. We noticed in our short time is that the turnover of other doctors as well is it takes a bit out. So you make a really good relationship and that person leaves and you go, okay, we got to build another relationship again. So it is a bit tiresome in that regard.
Despite this, Dr. Patey notes that his time in the community was important. He knows that, even if temporarily, he filled a role and helped patients. He also acknowledges that his time in rural Newfoundland made him more aware and considerate of the needs of other rural practitioners.
The specialists who accept you the most are those specialists who spent time in a rural community. They don't even question it. Sometimes those physicians who've never really spent their time in a rural community realize what it's like to be isolated and being the only one, that there's a little bit of hesitation that's there. I'm very glad that I spent that year in St. Anthony and really get a true feel of what it's like to work in a rural community.
Unlike the doctors we've interviewed who live in their respective communities, Patey commutes to his rural practice each day. He runs a family practice clinic and works in the Carbonear Hospital Emergency Department. Patey admits that his practice isn't the traditional busy practice of the past.
I don't feel like a full family doctor working in these spots 5 days a week. And whenever I see those doctors who are working there, I feel guilty about that in some regard, but I've got to say, this is what I can provide. This is how I can work in my environment in order to maintain that style of practice. But those physicians who are sitting in those communities are the true, I call, rural family physicians, and should be told that they're doing a great job in those spots, because those are hard jobs. Those are not easy jobs.
In recent years, some of the most experienced family doctors in Carbonear have retired.
20 years ago, there were some physicians who moved in and set up, and they were well established, carried heavy load practices. We had probably 4 of those older style family docs who retired within 2 to 3 years. So you left this mass of 10,000, 12,000 patients who probably looked without family doctors.
While this may seem like the perfect opportunity for new medical graduates to set up practice, it may not be.
I think at some point there was some family docs who had 4,000 patients, and they were seeing 60 to 80 per day. So very high volume practices, and that was the older school, the older model of practice. You would go and you'd work for 30 years, you would work 5 days a week, you'd work from 8 till 6, and you'd just continually see patients. And as we know, family doctors that are graduating now are not necessarily looking for that.
Without senior physicians to mentor new graduates, and a patient population too large to be taken on by a single or even multiple physicians, such a commitment is often seen as too intimidating, further perpetuating a void in patient care.
It'll come again, there's just a little bit of a turnover now. And you'll find family docs who find their style to work into that. It may take 8 to replace those 4, but they will come, because I think it's just an ideal spot to work.
This lack of primary care puts increased demand on other parts of the system. the emergency department becomes bogged down with minor complaints, off-work notes, and prescription refills. Patients with chronic medical conditions become victims of the lack of continuity, their conditions go unmanaged, and they deteriorate in the community until they need emergency care and hospitalization. In many ways, Carbonear is a microcosm for the state of our province's healthcare system as a whole. An aging and comorbid population, a lack of primary care physicians, and a turbulent transition to the new age of physicians who seek variety and work-life balance to sustain their practice in these rural areas. In search for context about the past, the present, and the way forward, we headed south to Placentia, our last interview with one of the province's most seasoned family physicians.
I'm Anthony John Rockall. I was born in New Zealand and I did my medical degree there. I was going to do ophthalmology, but I got diverted into brain research, and I had a research fellowship to Oxford. And at the end of 4 years, the money was running out, and the Newfoundland government was looking for physicians. So I came over here just to see how things would be, and I've been here ever since, which was 1976.
Much has changed during Dr. Rockall's 40-plus years in Placentia. When he first came here, he worked under the cottage hospital system, a time when rural hospitals operated independently and with significant physician leadership, not regionalized into health authorities like they are now.
The cottage hospital system was scattered right across the island. In the 80s, they closed it down, which was a great blow, I think, to rural medicine. We did have roughly the same number of physicians, but I think the workload was a lot harder. We worked long hours. We had pretty heavy responsibilities. In fact, we used to do surgery here, and we did many deliveries. If you were on the medical staff, you were expected to give anesthetics. I think if I had to do it now, I'd be quite terrified. But at that time, it was just part of the deal. We had to do it. We did have access to St. John's for cases that were beyond our expertise, but we were expected to do a lot of things that we wouldn't dream of doing now. And I think the new generation of physicians aren't prepared to put up with a lot of the hardships that we had to then. And I think if I had known better, I wouldn't have put up with it either. Family life suffered as a result of the lifestyle that we had back then. I think there's a more sensible balance being promoted now.
However, that new balance comes at a cost. Dr. Rockall feels that what he gained in work-life balance, he lost in the autonomy of his work and the resources available to him.
At one time we had full lab facilities here, and gradually they've been taken away from us and all centralized into Carbonear. For example, in the lab we have people, some who are trained just exclusively for lab work. We have people who are trained for X-ray plus lab. If the person who's X-ray plus lab is on call, then we can get X-rays at night. But if they're not on call, we can't get an X-ray. And that can be the whole weekend. And just because the board is not prepared to pay the overtime, we think that's very disrespecting of us and dangerous too. We're expected to, just temporize without X-ray and sort of decide whether it's safe to send that patient home without an X-ray, or whether we should incur the cost of sending them by ambulance somewhere to get an X-ray, which ends up costing way more than it would if they just paid a technician to come in here. We talk about physician burnout. I don't know if you've heard this term moral injury. It seems to be a term now which is getting more traction, and I think I can identify with that. We're asked to do more and more with less and less. And I think that's where the burnout comes a lot of the time. It's the feeling of helplessness. You have responsibility, but not much autonomy, not as much as we had.
Dr. Rockall paints a somber portrait of rural healthcare. An evolution from rural doctors who felt overworked and overburdened, but who now feel under-resourced and under-supported. Burnout feeds the rural revolving door.
At one time in the early 2000s, we had 60 doctors come through here in 4 years. The continuity of care obviously suffered enormously, and patients didn't know who they're going to see next, and it was very upsetting for them, especially older people who have complicated medical history. It's dangerous. I mean, you have people who have to pick up the threads of what was being done when the previous physician left.
Our interview with Dr. Rockel underscores a quintessential theme. There are gross inequities between rural and urban healthcare services and significant barriers to the provision of healthcare in these areas that continue to go unchecked. The inequities between urban and rural healthcare are not new. They've spanned decades, and they change only in the particulars of what services may be cut or what funding may be slashed. And while the barriers and challenges of providing healthcare to rural Newfoundland and Labrador vary across time and region, their pervasiveness does not. Overall, it paints a bleak picture. Rural inhabitants with complex chronic health needs packed in the waiting rooms of a small group of exhausted and under-resourced rural physicians, all set in the framework of a seemingly unchangeable system. At the end of our tour, and with no more physicians to look for answers, we felt deflated. Even for us soon-to-be medical graduates and physicians, it made us question, should we be getting away from here? Disheartened, disenchanted, we archived our footage on some hard drives and turned our focus to our studies. The project, an exciting 2-week road trip, faded into memory, and the archives slowly gathered dust.
The outbreak of a new viral pneumonia in China is on the move.
The world is on edge as the novel coronavirus breaches more national borders.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
The coronavirus pandemic.
Months later, we found ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic.
COVID-19.
It took the world by surprise and changed the function of our everyday lives. In March, Canada entered full lockdown measures, and medical students working in hospitals across Canada were suddenly removed from their clinical duties and sent home. The world shut down. And for all of us, it felt like the world slowed down. Time and isolation gave us the opportunity to reflect on our journey as medical students and encouraged us to contemplate our future as we prepared to enter our final year of medical school. In the quiet of our homes, with no distractions, we rediscovered the hundreds of hours of raw footage of our documentary. What we found surprised us. Previously discouraged about the state of rural healthcare, we found the footage and the physicians we interviewed told a very different story when we listened a second time around. The physicians we interviewed were not defeated warriors on an impossible battlefield. They were strong, motivated leaders fighting for a better future for themselves and their communities. The physicians we interviewed were champions of the rural cause. They fought to improve services in their respective communities, not because they couldn't go elsewhere, but because they believed in their work and they believed in their communities. More importantly, they had the answers.
The days of Dr. Olds are gone. The days of Dr. Grenfell are gone.
Family medicine is changing, and it has to.
Recruiting doctors to rural sites is a pervasive issue. We've heard it across the board. When it comes to the grand seduction, our docs know what it takes to reel them in.
Whose responsibility is it to replace that physician? That's the current debate amongst the powers that be.
If you were wanting to come to work in this clinic here with us, that's not advertised by Eastern Health. It's not the regional health authority's job to staff this office. So one of the things I said to council is you guys need to ask yourself, what can you do to draw somebody to rural Newfoundland? You may say 2 years, no business tax. That in most settings is about $5,000. The mindset is that medicine, it's huge money makers and, they're going to make a fortune, so why should we give them any incentives? Most of these towns have no idea what medical students graduate owing.
A well-known and researched approach to recruiting new doctors is to expose students to rural communities early.
There's always been a big push to recruit out of medical school with the incentives, say getting bursaries and that sort of thing.
There is some evidence to show that those who grew up in rural areas are more likely to practice in rural areas once graduated. But going back home might not always be the best option.
If you are, like my husband, from Deerwood, and the guys you went to high school with, your patients, it's almost too familiar. So the problem is you either know no one and you're lonely, or you know everyone and it's overwhelming. And so I think that's why people move very quickly. And Memorial has really tried to increase recruitment of rural students, hoping they go back to practice rural medicine, but this is the problem they run into.
So maybe it shouldn't be about the push to go back home to practice, but rather stoking the fire that is the affinity towards rural medicine.
There's a big draw to be in a rural area. If I had children, they wouldn't be in swimming lessons, they wouldn't be going to hockey school, but they would be going out on a skidoo in the wintertime and ice fishing with their parents. They would be going out and catching cod in the summertime or catching the capelin as they roll on the beach. They would be out living on the land and learning from nature.
We start with second-year medical students doing a wilderness first aid survival course, and we feel like it's important to expose them to a positive rural experience at that point before they go on their clinical clerkship experiences.
With the push to send more students into rural and remote areas at some point during their training, some would ask, are we sacrificing the quality of their education by sending them to learn in areas where even basic services like X-ray aren't available? Or are these rural rotations actually functioning as a superior learning experience for students to hone their skill?
You often hear those phantom stories about a place not being good enough to send medical students or to send residents. I don't buy that. I mean, if you can put a physician in any place, a student can go there, a resident can go there. Whilst you are helping to retain people by involving people who are already in the system with a medical school, you would also help expose people into those situations. And then eventually when they come in, you don't get a shock.
In family medicine in particular, the world is your option. You can go wherever you want, you can work whenever you want, however you want. That's the appeal of family medicine. So unless you spend time as a learner, you're not going to consider the option. So first you have to bring people and have a strong teaching program, and then you have to show them the practice they can envision themselves doing and participating in. Mm-hmm. Because unless you spend time working in a community, you don't know what to expect, and you're not going to even consider it as an option.
But it's not just medical students we need to focus on. We need experienced doctors and mentors to come work in these areas now.
Maybe we need to look at focusing on people who are my age, people who have their children as adults and who want to get away from cities and maybe go back to a more rural practice. I think it's important too to get somebody who's solid in a community as an anchor. It's scary to go out there and be on your own, so you're not going to get somebody who's just green out of medical school who's going to come and set up a solo practice. But if you have somebody who's got a good established practice, more people are going to want to be a part of that. When you do your rotations out of town and you find a practice that fits your style and you have somebody you know who's going to be there to be your mentor, to be your guide, then you're more likely to go there.
It's always hard to be the first to come to an area of our generation and the way we were trained. But we had a lot of mentors that we really looked up to when we were traveling and doing rotations, and they were such great role models for us. We were so inspired by the work they were doing, not just in the hospital, but also in their communities.
These ideas and concepts put forth by the doctors who live and work in rural areas about the rural dilemma need to be heard. And they need a seat at the table when it comes to making meaningful strides towards recruiting more doctors to rural areas.
We're so spread out over a wide geography. So for us to come together and have a united voice is really challenging. So these family practice networks are going to really help us all bond together and have an ombudsman to act on our behalf in order to help communicate and make sure that we're all on the same page and that we have a voice in decision making.
We need to figure out how we better deliver primary care. We're hopeful that the primary health care networks will help in that regard.
I just think we'll get further by being a larger team than we will by being an individual bunch of communities.
A relatively new concept to Newfoundland and Labrador, family practice networks provide otherwise isolated family physicians with a united voice with which they can work with regional health authorities and the government to elicit positive change for the betterment of the communities, their people, and the provision of primary care.
Shallow is Newfoundland's first and largest family practice network. It's not a unique concept. It's been used for years now in British Columbia, Alberta, and other places with huge success, I should say. We've recruited family doctors across our region, and what we're trying to do is find out what are the common themes and challenges our physicians are facing, and how do we come together for unique solutions that work for us, and how do we deploy them in any community.
We're actually developing our own family practice network. We don't have a fancy name yet, but that incorporates myself along with physicians in Clarenville, in Buren, and Conception Bay North, so Carbonear, that area.
The last few years we've been developing throughout Newfoundland these family practice networks, and the rural eastern one is just getting off the ground, which Sarah and I are involved in.
We've looked at how do all these separate little groups come together to kind of tackle recruitment as one unified approach. What does everybody bring to the table, and what can we put together as a recruitment package, and have that package available for each one of our sites. And you include things like, well, what services are available to the community, what amenities do they have, what social groups are available, what can your kids do, what can your spouse do, what schools are available, how does school life work, are there tutoring services available, what is your shopping like, what is your grocery like. There are only, I think it's 18 sites underneath Central Health umbrella, so that's not an insurmountable project to tackle.
Just recently, our family practice network has worked together to get an after-hours walk-in clinic.
Moving forward, we're hopeful that at least you'll have the communication necessary to make decisions together. Very exciting. For example, when I was doing a locum in Bonavista, it was at the time they were taking away their after-hours x-ray services, and the community was petitioning on the sidewalk and all sorts of things like that. But looking back, if you could vision the physicians and the regional health authority communicating with one another and saying, you know what guys, we really can't afford this service, and my response to that would be, okay, well, why don't you train the physicians there on point of care ultrasound, and after hours they can do 90% of what they need to without an x-ray. That's a totally different ballgame from one day you don't have this service.
Communication is so important.
Yeah.
And I think the RHA is willing to communicate if we're willing to work with them.
And if there's a means to do that, and that's what
Exactly.
these family practice networks are
be
doing.
really
It's impossible to communicate with these silos of physicians.
And while some physicians are working to organize into formal family practice networks, the same philosophy is behind the work of other rural practitioners, like Dr. Chris Patey, who sees the emergency department as a hub where all the rural family doctors can interact, plan, and overall build a sense of community.
What I've tried to do is bring more of the family doctors who are sitting in their isolated practices to come do some double coverage in our emergency department and bring them back to the hospital instead of these silos. When I'm working side by side with the family docs who are sitting in Harbour Grace, I love it. I think that supporting group is really what we need to people feel that they can work in these environments and enjoy it, truly enjoy it.
In the long term, family practice networks will hopefully function as a way for the government, the regional health authorities, and the community to communicate. The goal is that this not only improves the decision-making process, but works to keep doctors in these rural communities.
I think sometimes in terms of recruitment, we do an okay job in rural areas of filling the holes where they need to be. But I think what we sometimes lack in is focusing on retention. Anybody can decide, oh, I'm going to go here for a few years, or I'm going to go here for residency. But how do you keep that student or that physician in that community? And that's not a job of Eastern Health. That's not a government job. That's the community's job. It's the physicians in the community. It's the town council. It's the guy who owns Sobeys down the street. It's all of our job to get involved and embrace that person in the community, because it really does take the whole community to not only bring people here, but to keep them.
I often think about communities crying out and saying, we need more docs, we need more family doctors. And then when they can't get an appointment with their family doctor for 2 weeks, they complain. If you can't get an appointment with your family doctor for 2 weeks, it's probably because they're entirely overworked. They're going to say, why would I stay here when people are complaining that they can't get to see me? The ones that are there, you got to support them as best they can. And to me, it's a bit to the regional health authorities to do some of that work.
I think all the above can help. And just to expand on that one, that is very essential. Because if I wasn't getting that support network, I would not feel comfortable doing the work that I'm doing. And therefore, I would feel like going to a place where I would have that.
The one thing I think we do need is a group of locum physicians who can come in and replace physicians who need leave. I think the government should be prepared to fund even half a dozen who are available at short notice to go to different communities. It would make life so much better, you know.
Dr. Dankwa echoed a similar sentiment about the need for temporary replacements.
Most of us, our conscience are being driven by our duties and responsibilities to our patients. So if somebody knows that, oh, somebody is stepping in to help, they will find it easier. So we need that support. But if you think somebody is getting to that brink, have somebody not on a phone or something, physically in to relieve that individual.
But it's not just about having time off when needed. Retaining doctors requires that they enjoy what they do, and that means striking a healthy work-life balance.
At the end of the day, you want to feel like you're not sacrificing everything for the sake of your career, that your life isn't passing you by while you're up here, you know, away from your family and friends. And so I think you want to keep people here, you've got to make them feel like their life is still happening and they're not a slave to their job.
I could not do 5 days a week of full family practice. I do not have it in me. I can't do it, and I openly say that. And if that's a fault, I accept that.
I don't practice 5 days a week in my clinic, in my family medicine clinic. It's about sanity. I can't do the same thing every day. I had to have variety. I had to do some different stuff just to be able to maintain job satisfaction. I'm still providing a service in another area. It's just not sitting in my family medicine clinic. You can't just simply look at a number and say, well, there's 600 family doctors in Newfoundland and Labrador. They should be able to handle 600,000 patients. You got to look at the number of doctors who don't practice in a clinic 5 days a week. You know, a lot of those doctors work in an emergency room or work some other service or some other subspecialty and are practicing in a family medicine clinic.
People don't want 1 in 2, 1 in 3 call. You know, so is there a better delivery model for a center that has 3 physicians and 24-hour coverage? Would we be better off with a 12-hour coverage and allowing some hospital work in Buren so they feel better connected and not in an isolated silo, you know, 20, 30 minutes away?
Listen, variety is the spice of life. That's why I love emergency medicine. That's why I still do house visits. That's why I still do some practice in the clinic. And I think that variability makes family practice a little bit more pleasing, a little bit more like, oh God, I can step out of my standard office chair and say, I'm going to take some lumps and bumps off for a half day. And it makes the job a little bit more interesting, I think.
The future of healthcare in rural Newfoundland and Labrador will depend on doctors moving to these isolated areas. The future also relies on them staying. We asked the physicians we interviewed, will you be staying in rural Newfoundland and Labrador?
Probably the rest of my career anyway. I'm looking at Vancouver to settle down.
I would say I don't know exactly. You know, I came here for 1 year and I'm in my 10th year of practice here.
We have everything that we need here in Clarenville, and we're very satisfied personally and professionally here in Clarenville.
I have no intentions of going anywhere. If somebody wants to kick me out, that's a different story.
I would struggle with the loss of autonomy if I were ever to change to urban practice. So I think rural practice, absolutely. Rural generalism, there aren't enough of us. But will I be in this particular town forever? Oh, I don't know. It would be nice.
When my colleagues start retiring and start leaving, that is when I'm going to consider whether or not I'm staying. Because if that model cannot continue, then I don't know what I want to do. Maybe some resort needs a doctor. If you're out there and you're watching this on a resort, I will come work at a resort for you. That's not a problem. I can do that.
I would like to be able to offer locum services to people who are like me in rural places where they don't have somebody who will come and fill in for them. But my home base will be Port Blandford, because as much as I've traveled to various places, every time I come home I realize that this is beautiful.
20 years. Yeah, if I can, I'll be there for the rest. I've said to myself, I'm dedicated to going back there, and I'm staying there. I don't want to be the one who turn around and move on. I love the practice so much. I love the people there, and I will continue on.
While some of our physicians are happy to stay in rural Newfoundland and Labrador and keep their practice open, others are more uncertain. Our journey has come to an end, but the work of these rural physicians is far from over. More than just rural doctors, these are physician leaders. Their fight for improved services and patient care for their communities will continue. and it's important for us to acknowledge their efforts. Talk to your doctor. It's a common saying, but this time it means something a little different. Our call to action: talk to your doctor. Talk to them about their struggles of working in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. Talk to them about what they hope they can provide your community. Talk to them about how your community can better support them. We set out on this research journey in the middle of our medical training. Now we're in our final year and soon entering residency. We set out to find answers about the state of rural healthcare and physician well-being. But what we found was inspiration. We are inspired by these rural physicians and their demonstration of resilience and commitment to their communities. As we prepare for the next stages of our career, we have felt the pull to rural practice. What the future holds for us, and what the future holds for healthcare in rural Newfoundland and Labrador, that is up to us. And it's up to you.
Gym to pay $10 each to get access to the gym so we could get a shower.
Your mirror's in before you go on, and if there's any propane, make sure it's turned off.
Turn out of fuel. That's impossible. That's impossible. We coasted in where it says diesel available.
To meet you in the foggy dew. Droop your head, your rose of red, as the weeping willows do. You should droop your head in shame before a maid so sweet. And I says, pretty girl, won't you be my bride beneath our skies of blue? She smiled and said, you're the boy I'll wed. Down the hills I went one morn, a-singing I did go. Down the hills I went that morn, and she answered soft and low. She says, if you